Britain's general election last month left Prime Minister May with a minority government and without the strong mandate she wanted to negotiate Brexit. And now Westminster is alive with rumours of MPs and ministers plotting to stick the knife into her. Here in London, my guest is Iain Duncan Smith, former leader of the Conservative Party and now a leading pro-Brexit MP. Hasn't the country had enough of his party, drowning as it is in allegations of incompetence and dishonesty? Iain Duncan Smith, welcome to Conflict Zone. You wrote on the Conservative Home website the other day that after the support deal that your government has done with the Democratic Unionists in Northern Ireland, the Conservative Party will keep its integrity, you said. How can it possibly lay claim to integrity after deciding on public spending according to the needs of its own party to prop up the government?
Well, I think it's fairly normal. The government has a purpose, and the purpose is to govern and to get all the major bills and issues through. Of course, there's the very big issue of all of the repeal bills that are going through with regards to the European Union. So the Great Repeal Bill plus a total of about 8 bills, I think. That business has to go through because
But this is public purse being used for party purposes, isn't it?
Well, let's all grow up a little bit here and recognise that money is spent on all sorts of projects.
Yeah, but that's not integrity, is it?
Integrity is about governing and governing well for the country. And the reality is that Northern Ireland has always been a special case. Northern Ireland has always received proportionately more than most other areas for the very simple reason we've had significant troubles. I've been to Ireland many, many times, and it's quite clear that spending in Northern Ireland is always a justified case for spending more in Northern Ireland.
But you wouldn't spend it now. This decision would not have been taken unless it was designed to prop up the government. Well, yes, you do. You do know.
Sorry, I disagree with you totally. You don't know the answer to that question. And nor do I. I've been in government long enough.
It took weeks to negotiate this. It wasn't something that was just
I
in the
have been in
starting
government
gate ready
many
to
times.
happen.
Labour governments, Conservative governments, they have always made decisions about Northern Ireland as a special case provision. And it happens to be that the Labour government previously wanted to do a deal with DUP.
Yeah, but I asked the Labour what they're doing. I'm asking what the Conservatives are doing.
My point is,
and my point is using the public purse for party purposes.
And by the way, anywhere in Europe this goes on the whole time, so that's what I call
So just because other people do bad things, you can go on doing it.
It's not bad. What's bad about it? What's bad about helping people in Northern Ireland? Can you give me one thing that's bad about it?
It's bad about using the public purse for party purposes.
The public purse is paid for by people in Northern Ireland as well.
Party purposes, yes.
It's not party purposes, it's government purposes.
All right, to keep this party in power then?
No, to keep a government in power governing and not have chaos. I think that's worth the money.
Theresa May didn't have to call the election, did she? She gambled and lost, and if your party had pride and self-respect, she would have resigned the next day, wouldn't she?
Do you do maths much? Because she didn't lose, she won. The Labour Party
she lost what she wanted, didn't she?
The Labour Party lost the election, so let's get
yeah.
Okay.
And she was left without a majority.
Yeah, she didn't get an overall majority, so the result is she's the majority party. It's for her to form a government. She's done that, and she's now governing. That's the way of politics, I'm afraid. We may wish for other things, but sometimes they don't come off like that.
The morning after the election, she stood in front of number 10 Downing Street and pretended nothing had happened, failed to acknowledge the slap on the face that the country had given her, failed to mention that she'd listen and learn lessons from what the voters told her. She just said, let's get back to work. You have to wonder what planet she's on, don't you?
Well, she's on this planet and she has to govern, and we're in the middle of a negotiation. We're leaving the European Union within the 2 years. We set the March date. We invoked Article 50. That sets and changes everything. And the result of that, the government has to get on and govern. And she won the election. She didn't lose it. We didn't win it by the amount that we would have wished. We didn't have an overall majority. But we've been in this situation before. Her purpose, therefore, is to bring that stability to the government and make sure we get on and do the job.
But she said what the country needs more than anything is certainty.
Yep.
No admission of any kind that the certainty the country had possessed just before the election had gone as a result of her move.
Well, I wasn't in favour of holding the election in the first place, but we held an election.
So why not admit when she got something wrong? She gambled.
Well, she has actually subsequently. And
she lost the gamble.
No, she has subsequently. You need to read and listen to everything that she said. She
didn't that morning, did she?
Look, she has over the last few weeks said on many occasions that she took the decision. She therefore takes the responsibility for it. She even went so far as to say to my party and to the wider public that she bears the responsibility for there not being an overall majority, and she has to get it.
Only when she was reminded that she hadn't actually apologised to
Well, you don't know that. She said it. So
well, there were plenty of reports to that effect, weren't there?
Well, lots of things you said in your life you didn't quite get right, and you said later on, I'm sure. So let's just give her the benefit of the doubt.
In your article, you warned that if the Conservatives fail to make their minority government work, the alternative, Labour's leader, Jeremy Corbyn, was already staring out of the abyss, dressed in a Lenin hat and Marxist ideology. But you omitted to point out that if Corbyn does take power, it'll be your party that will have gifted him to the nation, won't it?
Well, I think that was the point I was making, wasn't it? So the point is we don't want Jeremy Corbyn in power for lots of very good reasons. Some of them are international reasons. I think his attitude towards both defence, security and terrorism are all distinctly dangerous and wanting. I know I'm...
So dangerous that Theresa May now wants his advice?
No, what she's actually said is there are a whole series of areas where various political parties actually need now to show some common sense. One of the areas I looked at was the area of elder care and social funding. This has been kicking around amongst political parties.
She wanted his advice on Brexit?
No, she said across the board. It's not advice, by the way. It's about saying, look, if you stood on a manifesto, as the Labour Party did, to leave the European Union, which included leaving the customs union and the single market, by the way, Mr MacDonald and Mr Corbyn made that very clear after the election, and the Conservatives stood on the same manifesto, then there does seem to be some common sense in the idea that when those things come before you and before Parliament, what she's actually saying is, don't you think you have a responsibility then to back up your manifesto by not voting those things down, but actually supporting the government as it takes that legislation through, delivering, by the way, on what was one element of Labour's manifesto.
This is a man that the party referred to as being in charge of a coalition of chaos. He was sucking up to terrorists, and now you want his help because it's a sign of desperation.
Not really. They tick all those boxes. Exactly right what our allegations about him were, because they're all true. The reality, however, is...
Well, you wouldn't want him then helping you out, would you, on all these subjects across the board?
Politics is about votes, and at the end of the day, the Labour Party stood on a manifesto on a number of issues, one of which was leaving the European Union. I come back to that single fact. If you stand on a pledge to the British people, 85% of the voting public voted to leave the European Union on those manifestos, and they were very clear in that manifesto, and they have actually been very clear subsequently, although they're now in a bit of a mess because it appears some of his party doesn't agree with him. But notwithstanding that, they all signed off on the manifesto.
A lot of your party doesn't agree with Theresa May. This is the fact,
Not really, I have to say
this government isn't working.
No, you're quite wrong about this.
Even you yourself took a swipe at some party figures who you called with big mouths and small brains.
Yes, lots of those around.
Yeah, so you're fighting like ferrets in a sack.
Not really. There's a few people who constantly give of their opinion when nobody really wants to hear of it. So my answer to them is...
But they want to express it. That's a democracy.
Good for them. Good for them. But it's not...
I mean, you can't agree about May, whether she should stay or go. You can't agree about Brexit, whether the European Court of Justice should be have some say in British affairs or not. There are big differences in your government, in the Conservative government.
Well, actually, there aren't. The Conservative Party is almost completely united around the process of leaving the European Union, and also, by the way...
On leaving, but it's the mechanics. It's the
mechanics. We're in a negotiation. Excuse me, do you know the outcome of a negotiation?
No, we're talking about the mechanics. With the party doesn't even know what it wants. The government doesn't even know. No, the government doesn't even know what it wants.
Well, you don't either, so we're in the middle of a negotiation. My point is, you negotiate. That's what you do.
You negotiate with the European Union.
Yes.
The European Union appears to know what it wants. This government doesn't appear to know what it wants.
Actually, I did read the other day that there are a number of people in the European Union that don't agree with the Commission. For example, I think it was the Austrian finance minister, I may be wrong about exactly what job he holds, or maybe it was a commissioner, I can't remember, but he actually said quite clearly that he thought the UK was in an incredibly strong position because the European Union needed the trade. We've also had the finance...
Well, he's the only one, isn't he? He's the only one.
Let me finish. The finance minister of Bavaria lectured Mrs Merkel the other day about making sure that she didn't screw up the negotiations because over 1.5 million jobs in Bavaria rely on exports to the UK of machine tools and cars alone. There are plenty of others. I talk to a lot of European businesses. I was talking to a person the other day that does low-tech product. He's a Belgian manufacturer. He produces potatoes, and he said the last thing we need in Europe is a tariff wall because my business would go down the tubes. I employ lots of people. I said, have you spoken to your politicians? He said, we're talking to them now. So before we just get this out of kilter, the European Union is in a position where they're not all together completely united, and they also recognise that they do need a trade deal. as much, if not more,
Well, you keep
than the
saying
United
that,
Kingdom does.
but the chiefs of the German industry on Sunday told The Observer that their key priority was to keep the unity of the single market together. You know that perfectly well.
Yes, but
that
of course
matters
they would
more
say
than,
that, wouldn't
I mean,
they?
you make these comfortable
They would
assertions
say
that
that,
every...
wouldn't they?
Well, you always say that.
Well, of course they would, because I'm in the middle of a
Anybody who
negotiation.
disagrees with you is talking
I'm
nonsense.
in the middle of a negotiation.
Aren't
It's what you
Aren't
say.
they?
It's what you say to people privately that matters. Publicly, of course, the Commission is going to come out and say all sorts of nonsense because it's in the middle of a negotiation. You don't give away your hand at the start of a negotiation. Sometimes people don't realise that because they've never negotiated. But I have negotiated in business and also in politics. Never give away your hand first, but I know what your bottom line is.
Well, you say that, but I mean, the wolves are circling around Theresa May, aren't they? The plotting has begun, the off-the-record briefings to journalists. How long has she got?
She's got as long as it takes. We'll get through this negotiation, complete process, leave the European Union.
But the knives are out for her,
It's up to her when she wants to stay, when she wants to go.
The knives are out in the Tory party, aren't they? They smell weakness.
In politics, knives are always out. The question is really whether they're relevant, and they're not really relevant. The truth is...
Why not?
Because the party is very clear.
What use is a lame dog of a Prime Minister to negotiate the most important thing Britain has had to talk about internationally for the last 40 years?
Well,
what use is that?
Hang on a second. She's the Prime Minister heading a party that got the largest proportion of the vote share.
Heading a disunited party.
It's not disunited. It's totally united around the
They're
purpose.
arguing every day about different aspects
Politics,
of Brexit.
people argue all the time.
Yeah, so they can't agree on anything.
Do you know a political party anywhere in Europe that doesn't argue? What's the point of being in politics if you don't debate and argue?
They can't agree on anything, can they?
Yes, we agree absolutely that we're leaving the European Union.
The Chancellor goes abroad and mocks the Foreign Secretary on his having his cake and eat it stance. I mean, there's no unity inside the Cabinet, is there?
I disagree
At least
with you.
there used to be.
I disagree with you. I sat in Cabinet, and Cabinet spends its whole time debating and arguing. That's exactly the nature of it. And sometimes that breaks out into public, sometimes it doesn't. It did under David Cameron, it has under John Major, it has under Tony Blair. That's the nature of government and Cabinet government and politics. But the single issue is not whether people debate or argue. The single issue is what is the final agreement and its purpose.
You
We're
think
in the middle
EU
of a negotiation, and that's what we're doing.
EU hasn't noticed that she's weak?
I don't know what the EU notices. It's not really that irrelevant to me. My point is, what the EU has to notice at the end of the day, more importantly, is what are our terms and what do we want.
But they're in the driving seat so far, aren't they? Michel Barnier is in the driving seat.
No, I don't agree. I don't agree at all.
He's already won first blood.
Not really. I don't see what this first blood is.
He's already said that he's set the timetable. He said that the divorce comes first and the trade talks come afterwards. Britain wanted to
tell me what the
two
divorce
things
is then.
together.
Tell me what the divorce terms are then.
It's the I don't know yet.
Precisely.
And nor do you.
Exactly.
Yes.
Nor does he.
Yeah, but he's saying this is the order in which we will do things, and the Chancellor
and the
government
simple.
has accepted
Let me
it.
just tell you something very clear, important, and Mr. Barnier knows that. You cannot settle the financial position of both the EU and the UK until you have completed what our relationship is afterwards.
He doesn't see it that way.
No, I'm sorry, he knows this to be a truth.
How many
Hang on, let me
how
tell
many
you.
trade deals have you negotiated?
Let me tell you, I know a bit more about trade deals than you do. Let me
How
tell
many
you.
trade deals
Let
have you
me tell you
negotiated?
something about this trade deal, all
How
right?
many?
So just stop interrupting me and just let me tell you about a trade deal, all right? You might learn something. Here's what has to happen. As we leave the European Union, we will also re-enter the WTO as a voting member. We're a member, but we're not a voting member. Now, the schedules that are owned by the EU actually have a financial tag to them. So unless they agree with us the amount of money that we pay to take some of those schedules relevant to us and lodge them at the WTO, they will end up, as the EU, spending a great deal more money for less potency. Now, here's the point. They have to settle that. That's not, they might. They have to settle that at the time we leave. Otherwise, they pick up a bigger bill. So Mr. Barnier knows very well that until this, for example, is settled, nothing is settled. And that is why my point to you is very clear about trade deals. The importance is what is our relationship with the EU, because it informs what the financial settlement is between us and the EU, and it completes that.
You have never negotiated a trade deal.
I'm sorry, I was in business. I spent my whole time
Yes, you've been in
abroad
business, but you've never negotiated an international trade deal.
I'm telling you now, I know how to negotiate a trade deal, and
You've
so
never
does
done
the
one.
government.
You've never
I know
done one.
many people
You've never
I've
done
talked to
one.
who have done
Okay.
it. So hang on a second. Europe hasn't negotiated that many trade deals. So
they've got a lot of trade negotiators.
Yeah, and the Swiss have done far more, and we've had them over here and talking to us. We've had lots of people. We've got a guy, for example, at the moment who's at one of the think tanks who was a negotiator for the United States. It is not about that. It is about knowing what you have to do. So let me just be very clear to you. Don't tell me that Monsieur Barnier will settle everything up front, because it cannot be done.
I didn't say he said settle everything up front.
Well, you just did.
He
You said
settled
earlier
the agenda.
on. Yeah, you said
the order in which
I'm sorry, let me take you back.
These issues
let me take you back to
what
you said. You said the divorce bill first. My answer to that is you cannot settle what that is until you have settled everything. No deal is settled until everything is settled. And I gave you an example of why that is the case, or why the European Union knows that.
In Duncan Smith, you pride yourself on honesty, but it's dishonesty that's caused your party a lot of damage, hasn't it? In particular, the Prime Minister's apparent inability to answer straight questions with a straight answer, all too clear when the subject of care for the elderly came up in advance of the election. Your party manifesto ruled out a limit or cap on how much old people might have to pay for that care. The Health Secretary explicitly confirmed that. 4 days later, after a massive public outcry, the PM does a U-turn and agrees on a cap and then pretends nothing has changed. That's dishonest, isn't it?
It's not. It's called change.
In 4 days.
Yes, but I don't know what.
But she said there was no change. She kept on saying there was no change.
She's added the cap in.
Yeah.
Policy remains the same.
But the cap is exactly what's changed. There wasn't a cap, and 4 days later there is, and she says nothing's changed.
Well, the policy itself is essentially the same.
But the cap has changed.
Yes, but she's added the cap back in, which Mr. Dill not recommended. I don't have any particular problem with that, because
why say nothing's changed when it has?
Well, the
when you've
policy
inserted a
is the
cap.
same.
But that's dishonest, isn't it?
I don't think that's dishonest at all.
Why not? I mean, the country knew it, Tory MPs knew it, but she just couldn't level with the British people and admit that she'd changed part of the policy.
Well, that was an election.
Isn't that
We've been through that.
With dishonesty attached to it.
I don't think it's dishonest at all. It's just about what politics is about, and when you make a change, when you get something wrong and it's not right, you change it.
There were similar accusations.
Just out of interest, do you ever change anything in your life at all? Do you ever admit that you've done something differently?
I don't think people are interested in my answers.
Well,
I think they're interested in
But they know very well that's what life's like.
They're interested to hear
life.
yours.
Politics is an extension of life.
Yeah, and then you admit it. And if you haven't got the guts to admit it, you're seen as dishonest.
Well, the party admitted it.
She didn't. There were similar accusations of dishonesty about the Leave campaign, weren't there? And John Major called it squalid and deceitful. And in key places it was, wasn't it?
Look, both campaigns said lots of things during the course of the campaign, which you can argue about, were right, were wrong, were misleading. You know,
but the 350 million a week was wrong, wasn't it?
It's not wrong at all. Remember, there's a year behind when the main money is paid back that is there. Most of it's paid back on the basis of projects that the EU sets its mind to make. You know, I had lots of experience of that when I was at the Department for Work and Pensions. Lots of things that we would not have spent the money on, that we had to jump through hoops to try and get the money back from. So the whole debate about who controls that 350 million every year, it was very, very clear. And that is not all the UK. The UK does not control how much money comes back. It comes back in different projects. The
UK Statistics Authority said the figure was misleading. The Institute for Fiscal Studies called it absurd. You even had a Conservative MP, Sarah Wollaston, who defected to the Remain camp because she said the figure was wrong. You knew it was wrong. Nigel Farage even went to Michael Gove and said you shouldn't be using this figure. Take it out, it's wrong.
Yeah. Well, all I can say
you knew it was wrong when it was being used.
350 million represents the total amount of money that the UK makes its contributions. Any repayment has a year in arrears, so that money actually ends up in the EU for over 12 months before it actually gets paid back. Any of that money that is then paid back isn't all paid back on the behest of the government. It's paid back, in a sense, on bids for projects. Those projects are already set by the EU. So you can argue the control of that 350 million is not in the hands of the government, but in the hands of the EU. So this idea of net and gross is a misleading figure itself, and I argued that some time ago when I was at the department, because we don't control what the net figure is. That net figure is based on what the EU decides hugely, not what the UK does. So all we're simply saying is the basis of that was you take back control of the totality of that 350 million and you spend it thereafter on what you think are your priorities nationally, not what the EU thinks are its national priorities.
When challenged on the figure, you said our promises were a series of possibilities.
Yeah, you're taking back control. You make
Since when is a promise a possibility?
It's a promise to take back control, and then the decisions that are made by the government as to how you spend that money.
You promised to love and cherish your wife. Was that just a possibility?
No, no, no. I'm talking about what you do.
I'm talking about promises that politicians made.
No, no. The promise was to take back control of the decision-making. I wasn't in government, so I can't tell you what the government will do with that money. I can't promise you they will spend the money exactly in the way that I might want to do, because that's up to the government after the referendum. But what we were saying was, this is what is possible for the government to do. That's the point that I was making. I'm not in government. I can't tell you that the government is going to do it. Well, of course it is the way they saw it, because they voted for it.
350 million. We send the EU 350 million a week. Let's fund our NHS
just out of interest,
instead.
What about the other side that told us that we would...
Well, we talked to the other side.
Hang on. We'd face an immediate crash. The economy would go through the tubes and the economy would be bust directly afterwards. In fact, George Osborne said we'd have an emergency budget within days.
But just because they talk nonsense, did you have to talk nonsense as well?
I'm talking to you about what they said about the economy. That was their view of where life would be. Now, if they believed that, they were wrong.
You also claimed that the EU was sclerotic and dying. By February this year, the Eurozone had posted 14 consecutive quarters of growth. The unemployment rate had returned into single digits. Economic sentiment was at the highest level for 6 years. Job creation in the Eurozone has accelerated by January to almost a 9-year record, while the rate of output growth maintained a 5-year high.
OK, let's break it.
Growth was higher in 2016 than in the United States.
Let's break those figures up a little bit, shall we? A lot of that is driven by some key countries. If you go round and have a look at what's actually happening in the European Union, you'll know that a lot of this is papering over the cracks. Let's just have a look at France.
The figures are wrong?
Yes, the figures that you give are across Europe.
Yes,
let's just have a look at key countries.
For the 17 countries of the Eurozone.
Let's have a look at some of those figures for some of the key countries in there.
That's not sclerotic
You've
and
asked
dying,
me a question. I'll tell you what's sclerotic about this. France has a terrible rate of unemployment. Its youth unemployment is hugely higher. Italy, banks are bust. They're having to intervene to save the banks. Greece is completely bust. It's relying on handouts from the European Union, from the central bank. Spain's growth has begun, but its unemployment is still unbelievably high. If you start looking at whether this helps people, what really it's about is jobs and employment, you'll find actually the European Union's record on jobs and employment, with the exception of a couple of countries, Germany and the Netherlands, but for those other countries like France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece, you name those countries, they have had a terrible record. And there are still people languishing in years of unemployment in those countries and very angry about it. Now, just
but Iain Duncan Smith, if growth in the Eurozone outpaces the US, it outpaced the US.
Hang on. We are talking about a late, sudden growth in the Eurozone after years of chaos and problems.
Yes.
And many economists
will
also...
It's going up and not down, which is what you said.
Many economists will tell you categorically...
Sclerotic and dying were your words.
Exactly. It is still my belief. There is a real problem with competitiveness in the European Union, in the Eurozone, and that remains. The euro itself is part of the problem. And it has caused massive problems. If you go to Italy, for example, it has benefited Germany enormously. It has not benefited Italy at all.
Do you think a democracy can change its mind? Has a right to change its mind? This is what David Davis said in 2012. If a democracy can't change its mind, it ceases to be a democracy.
Well, that's what you hold elections about, isn't it?
Yeah, well, can it change its mind on Brexit? Perfect right to change its mind?
Well, we just had a referendum on it, so when do you want it to change its mind?
If it wants to, down the line.
Well, at some point, I'm sure, in the future, if somebody thinks that there's a strong enough opinion, they want to...
You don't want people questioning anymore. The message is you lost, stop moaning about Brexit and get on with it, isn't it?
No, the simple outcome is we had a referendum.
Yeah.
And we voted on it.
And if people change their mind down the line, they're perfectly at liberty to do that?
How do you know that they've changed their mind?
I didn't say they had. I said
well, no,
if.
You said if.
I said if.
You said if, exactly. That's my question. How do you know that?
If they change their mind down the line.
How do you know that they changed their mind?
Well, you will know. I mean,
how will I know?
People these days have a perfect ability
how do I know
to express their views.
Minds? How do I know I've changed?
You'll read it in all the opinion polls, won't you?
Opinion polls that picked the election, did they?
Well, they didn't do badly.
They picked the referendum too, didn't they?
Well, they were close.
They
were close. They were close, weren't they?
No, they weren't that close, actually. One of them said...
You still think people would vote to leave the European Union?
Well, I have no idea. I assume that they made their decision, and I'm told by these same polls that they haven't changed their minds. But I don't go on what the polls tell me. I simply say we had a referendum. What we don't want, and there was a very recent poll that said over 70% of the public said they want to get on with the process of leaving the European Union. Over half of those who voted Remain want us to get on with the process of leaving the European Union.
And 54% in a Survation poll said they'd vote the other way. They'd vote to Remain.
You know,
you can pick your polls.
Hang on a second. Do we have one? Should we have one every? No, I'm talking about what people want to do now, and what they want to do.
Well, this was 1st of July.
Less than 3 weeks ago, YouGov ran a poll asking the very simple question: what do you want? 70% said, let's get on with it. Over half of the Remain contingent said, let's get on with it.
What would it take, Iain Duncan Smith, for you to change your mind and say, I got it wrong?
Well,
we shouldn't be leaving the...
Well, like everything else, for arguments to be persuaded. I wasn't in favour of leaving the European Union until I actually came to within about 2 weeks of the referendum. I had not made my mind up to leave the European Union. I had actually defended staying in the European Union for the last 20 years. And said that it needed to change. I voted against Maastricht because I said the Maastricht Treaty would set Britain on a course to leave the European Union.
So what would it take for you to say, I got it wrong?
Well, if it proves that we got it wrong.
What would that mean? Economic downturn?
No, that we somehow...
Jobs being lost, left, right, and centre. What would it be? What would it be?
It would be that somehow the Europe turns out to go in one direction, we go in the other direction, and all in all, we think that it would be better if he hadn't done. That's the evidence, but I don't see where the evidence is to mount that, so I don't change my mind.
Good to have you on Conflict Zone. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.